Hello and welcome to the American Women Artists 2022 Symposium on Women on the Arts. My name is Sandra Harris. I'm the Executive Director of AWA. I am thrilled to moderate this incredible panel that we have for you today. If you're new to AWA, we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around over 30 years. We support women artists in all different stages in their careers through educational events like this, as well as promotion and support and coordinating shows in galleries and museums. If you will join us later this afternoon for the second half of the day, we'll talk much more about our museum shows and give the awards for our current show, which is at Customs House Museum and Cultural Center in Tennessee. So welcome. I do want to say that this symposium would not happen without the generous support of a donor who wishes to remain anonymous in support of Diana Reuter Twining, who is one of our master signature members as well as a board member. We rely on so many donors, so thank you to all of them. So for the symposium, this is an annual event that we gather different voices within the arts community to talk about the past, the present, and the future from their various expertise areas and perspectives. Today, we have three great speakers that will each do a presentation, well, four speakers, three sections, that will each do a presentation, and then we'll all come back together at the end for a roundtable. You'll hear first from Amy Von Lintel, Dr. Amy Von Lintel, who is from West Texas A&M. She's an art history professor as well as the head of the Gender Studies Department, which is the perfect blend for us. She also happened to write our introductory essay for the exhibition catalog this year, and she's worked with museums and she's an author, so really great perspective. After that, you'll hear from Dr. William Eiland, who's the director of the Georgia Museum of Art at University of Georgia. He has an incredible collection there, and he'll talk about many of the pieces they have that are from women artists, and he has a great career in the museum profession, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, you'll hear from Steven Bennett and Dr. sorry, I'm already coughing, Dr. Elaine Schmidt. And many of our working artists will recognize them as collectors of art by and about women, as well as the Bennett Prize. Many artists are just fans of that prize. It's a generous gift that they'll talk much more about that has really supported and launched the careers of many working women artists. So we're thrilled to have all of these folks with us. Quick housekeeping, this is a webinar, so you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. You can, if you're on the website, send questions in via chat that will come directly to me as moderator. We'll try to address them within the symposium. If not, we'll try to address them later. If you're live on Facebook, thank you for joining us there as well. And of course, you can use the chat feature with each other. And we have our fabulous social media manager, Victoria, online with you there as well. That's all the housekeeping. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over first to Amy Von Lintel. Thank you.
Hi, okay, so hopefully you can hear me. Thank you so much, Sandra, for the introduction. And I'm gonna go ahead and just dive in. You'll notice behind me is Georgia O'Keeffe on a motorcycle. It's one of my favorite things to Zoom with. So she's looking over my shoulder if you're wondering what that is. Okay, so I began my introduction to the AWA catalog this year with the news that the market for women's art is going up. And as the title for this year's exhibition says, women's art is indeed breaking through and on the rise. So what's some evidence for this? Well, we'll start here. In November of last year, Frida Kahlo's Diego and I broke a record for its sales at 34.9 million, which put her at the top of the Latin American market, and she outpaced even her husband, Diego Rivera. And this also put her as the second highest earning woman globally, only to Georgia O'Keeffe. So that's one of the reasons why I brought this image in. And O'Keeffe sold in 2014, her work, Gyms and Weed, sold for 44 million. Now, what this leaves us with is that this is an exciting moment for women's art sales, but we're not at the tip top yet because the market values here, even at the extreme end, as we're seeing with Frida and Georgia, remain way behind, earning only in the tens of millions per work, in contrast to the many, many male artists that have been consistently earning over 100 million per work. Now, why is this? Is it that men's art is inherently better? I obviously don't think that. Is it a gold standard for a good investment? Well, I think it's more about market confidence. Traditionally, men's art has been seen as a better market bet, safer, and everyone seems to have just kept agreeing on it and paying those prices. So how do we break the cycle? How do we create added market confidence in women's art? One answer, we build networks of value and worth around it, just like we're doing with this exhibition. And one of the things that history has shown us is that women have often been the most willing to bet on the worth of women's art. For instance, it was, let me make sure that I gotta click it, there we go, sorry. For instance, it was Alice Walton of the Walmart fortune and founder of Crystal Bridges Museum who bet on spending that record amount for the O'Keeffe because she wanted the most valuable work by a woman artist in the museum that she, a woman, founded. She was also willing to bet that you don't have to have a museum in a big coastal city for it to be great. She put hers smack in middle America. Another risky bet, perhaps, yes, but I think it paid off. And as you see from the image on the left, general admission is always free. She lets us in for free if we make our way to Arkansas. Another bet on the worth of O'Keeffe was made by the Texas oil and gas heiress Anne Marion, who believed that a museum dedicated to O'Keeffe would be a success. She, like Walton, wanted to be a leader in the field of women supporting women and founded in 1997 one of the very first art institutions exclusively dedicated to a woman artist. Another artist whose market is now suddenly booming is Elaine De Kooning, who has yet to break 1 million per work, but who is selling strong in the 100,000s. And I'm pretty sure that scholarship like Mary Gabriel's excellent 9th Street Women, a book published in 2017, or even my own co-authored 2018 article in American Art has helped to push De Kooning's market upwards. The example that I'm showing you here, Red Bison, Blue Horse, sold about a year ago, 2021 March, for $562.5 thousand. And this is a related work to an illustration that we featured in our article. You see it down below. And we were arguing that her late cave paintings of bulls and bison related to her earlier famous bull series. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that the rise in women's art owes much to the support networks of women scholars, critics, museum directors, gallery owners, curators, and collectors. And at this point, I will pause to thank our fearless leader, Sandra, for all the work that she does in this vein. Now, this is not to say that men don't also contribute to this support network. Of course they do. Pardon me, this thing keeps wanting to do something on my computer and I need to make it quiet. Of course men do, and I don't want to diminish this at all. And even today, we're hearing from some very involved men in this very symposium. But given my own research, I want to take us on a little journey through the history of women supporting women artists. One of the first all-women shows was held in New York City in 1943 at the Art of this Century Gallery, which was organized, and the gallery was founded by Peggy Guggenheim. Guggenheim was not afraid to place her bets on women artists, and she was friends with many. Her show featured women of 16 different nationalities, and I show you this work on the left by little-known Leonore Feeney, which appears in the photograph of Peggy in her gallery, outlined in a red rectangle. But I think it's also worth taking a second to highlight the range of women artists in this show. Some, like Frida Kahlo, Louise Nevelson, and Mariette Oppenheim, are securely within the mainstream art history canon. Others, like Leonora Carrington, Elsa von Freytag Loringhofen, Dorothea Tanning, Sophia Tauber-Arp, Sonia Sekula, Jacqueline Lamba, Kay Sage, Gypsy Rosalie, and Hedda Stern, are all gaining more attention and deserved appreciation in the art world today. So they're on the rise, or at least their reputation is. Now others, I show you these three, I had never heard of, like Xenia Cage, Susie Freilinghausen, and Ira Delanix. This whole list of artists that featured in the show at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery, I had not heard of. And you can even see the difference here, this is from Wikipedia, between those that have a Wikipedia page in orange and those that don't in white. But I had fun playing the game of who are you and what did you make, just Googling their names. And I found some exciting discoveries. It never gets old to try to discover a new woman artist, at least in my opinion. And I invite you to do the same. I might just place my next bet on one of these artists. Another history-making show, although one that history did almost forget, perhaps because it was in the unlikely place of Amarillo, Texas, which you can see in the star on the map. If you didn't know where it is, that's where I live. That's where I'm sitting here right now, is the show The Women Tops in Art, 1960. It was at Dord Fitz's gallery, which you can see an image of the gallery in the lower image on the right. Now, Dord Fitz was an itinerant art teacher, gallerist, and kind of organizer for the area that I'm talking about. Now, hopefully this show will be remembered since I co-published an article on it with a woman who has now become my best friend. I call her my work spouse, and she's my writing partner, Bonnie Roos. Again, we find that, especially in the isolated area where we live, Women's Support Network keeps us going. And according to Fitz, this exhibition would be perhaps the largest all-woman group show to be held outside of New York, unprecedented in the Southwest. So I think he's responding to Peggy Guggenheim's show in the 40s, but also this idea that it is doing something new. And I want to ask ourselves what he means by the largest. Now, clearly it had a good number of artists, not as many as Peggy's 31 artists, but still a good number. And I'll take the time to read them. I know it's a little clunky to read artist names out loud, but how else are we to recognize them and give them a little credit? So bear with me. It included Elaine De Kooning, Yvonne Thomas, Helen Frankenthaler, Perla Fine, Ethel Schwabacher, Janice Biala, Pat Paslov, Claire Falkenstein, Linda Lindeberg, Patricia Bott, Jane Wilson, Jane Freilich, Nell Blaine, Miriam Shapiro, Linda Lindeberg, Hedda Stern, Mickey Wagstaff, Jean Reynaud, and Louise Nevelson. But large also describe the scale of the works themselves. Here, women went big with their art. They also went bold with their gestures and color. One reviewer even claimed their work was as big as Texas. And here we see a bright red, non-objective Helen Frankenthaler, over 5 feet squared, and a vertical Hedda Stern made with experimental spray paint, 7 feet tall. Yvonne Thomas's horizontal canvas with its abstract rectangular forms hung with Jane Freilicher's, quote, slightly rumpled realism, end quote, a phrase coined by her poet friend John Ashbery, which I just love that phrase. And these examples show the range of stylistic approaches from pure abstraction to recognizable landscape painting, but all of them had a deep commitment to modernist experimentation. And what I think this reminds us too is that there's no one universal or essential woman's style. I don't believe that exists. Now, Fitz's The Woman show also included three-dimensional works. And this was Claire Falkenstein's wire sculptures that were hanging from the ceiling and a Louise Nevelson black wall sitting on the floor. Would have been amazing to see this show. Now here I also highlight the caption mention of Martha Jackson, because she was yet another woman gallerist willing to take the risk to support the market for women's art. She claimed in 1959, after Jackson Pollock's death in 1956, that Nevelson would be the next Pollock. Martha Jackson also shepherded the sale of the work here, Moon Garden, to a collective group of art lovers in the Texas Panhandle, who raised the $5,800 in part through raffle sales to buy the piece. And many of the buyers, as you can see here, are women who continued to collect and support the work of women artists for decades. This sale also turned the tide of Nevelson's market, solidifying her worth in the realm of her male art colleagues and helped to pull her out of debt. In this charming photo, taken in the context of the all-woman show in 1960, It features a cowboy lunch on a Panhandle ranch that was arranged for the New York City guests. And it includes the rather chic dealer, Martha Jackson, outlined in red, plus the artists Elaine De Kooning and Louise Nevelson. Elaine is in the dark glasses on the left, and Louise is bending over Martha just to the right of her. And what you'll notice from this picture is one of my favorites. There's a mix of men and women, artists and cowboys, dealers and collectors. This photo shows a healthy, supportive network for women's art. Now in this slide, we see Dord Fitz with his little bow tie there, with a group of women art collectors and his art students, two of whose families still have numerous works of art that my research partner and I have gotten to view in person, hosted in their home. All of these, their homes are in the Texas Panhandle. And so I'm going to talk through these images a little bit. Here you see Bonnie standing next to a small Louise Nevelson that opens, like it has doors and that opens, that's on the left. Now on the upper right, you see her taking a photograph of a small scale Elaine De Kooning bowl piece. Down below is a Louise Nevelson wooden piece that fits inside of this niche in their house. It's just charming. And then below that, you see another one of the students of Dord Fitz who has collected memorabilia, and her rather modest-sized house is chock full of art from New York modernists. Because of these collectors and this support network, there are dozens upon dozens of works of art by talented women modernists that have remained in the isolated Texas Panhandle in both public and private holdings. So here we see an Elaine De Kooning painting of Betty Bivens Childers. Betty Bivens Childers is the woman with the red rectangle around her on the left. And she was friends with both Elaine and Louise Nevelson. She took art from Dord Fitz. She also founded the Amarillo Museum of Art, which is our local museum here. We also have works by mosaicist John Raynal, including wall works, large-scale wall works, and standalone pieces in private collections. We have Elaine De Kooning basketball players, beautifully colored bowls, and even one of her very rare columns, painted columns, where Elaine decided to go into the third dimension in 1961. We have works by artists that were also featured in the 1960 show, Linda Lindbergh and Jane Wilson, both of which were sold out of that show and have remained in the Panhandle ever since. Now this photo helps us see the sheer size of the Jane Wilson landscape Riverport. And you see on the right the two collectors who purchased this out of that 1960 show, Mr. and Mrs. Leigh Bivens. So these are relations of Betty Bivens Childers, and her name was also Betty Bivens, but it was a different Betty. It's kind of confusing. And you see here that Betty and Leigh also commissioned portraits from Elaine De Kooning that are in the Amarillo Museum of Art collection today. And I'll show you those up close just because they're gorgeous in their gestures and colors. Yet another portrait by Elaine De Kooning hangs in the Baker Art Center in Liberal, Kansas, named for Irene Baker, who was a student of Fitz and who hosted his classes. Remember how I said he was an itinerant art teacher? He would get in his car and drive 3 hours to Liberal from Amarillo and teach this class in her home. And the home has now been converted into the Baker Art Center. So that's what you're seeing on the right. And finally, two of my favorite pieces that are now in the Amarillo Museum of Art, a gold wall piece by Nevelson, who started painting her wooden work gold after coming to Amarillo in 1960 for that all-woman show. Maybe because she saw ranch houses that had gilded faucets, and maybe because we call this place the Golden Spread because it's just one big open plains. There could be a lot of reasons, but I think it's connected to her experiences in Texas. And then a stunning watercolor by Elaine De Kooning of JFK that, and I show you these not just because of them being in my local museum and not just because they're my favorite, some of my favorite works of art, but also because they were gifted by two women art students of Dord Fitz, Vera Beth Hicks and Phoebe Shelton. So this network of women supporting women continues. I have yet to find photographs of these two women. Someday I hope to. Now all this is part of the supportive network of women's modernist art in the Middle American West. This is the topic of our forthcoming book, Bonnie and my forthcoming book. It was also the basis of an exhibition that was held at the Amarillo Museum of Art in fall 2021 called Women of Abstract Expressionism in the American West. And you can see this gorgeous blue bull, which is another private collection holding that comes through this same support network and was purchased at that time through Dorn Fitz's connections. Now, another thread that plays a role in our book, but which deserves more attention, goes back to this Martha Jackson and gallerist connections. Women, gallerists, scholars, and museum directors at mid-century who were supporting these women too. And what you see here is one of my other favorite works of art, a mosaic of the gallerist Betty Parsons with her bright blue eyes, done by Jean Reynaud, and you can see it installed in that show just last fall. Now, all of these women contributed to the rise of women artists at mid-century, including Eleanor Ward, who ran the Stables Gallery. Hang on, I'm going to talk through a lot of women artists, so bear with me. But Eleanor supported the art of Louise Bourgeois, Elaine De Kooning, Perla Fine, Helen Frankenthaler, Grace Hardigan, Lee Krasner, Linda Lindeberg, Joan Mitchell, Hedda Stern, Yvonne Thomas, and Audrey Flack. We've mentioned how Martha Jackson was supporting Nevelson, but she also showed the work of Grace Hardigan and Alma Thomas, which is worth a comment here because Alma was not only a woman artist, but also a Black woman artist. And it's pretty progressive of Martha Jackson to be reaching out into the Black artist community as well. Betty Parsons in the upper right, you can see that in Reynaud's mosaic, she was drawing on these pictures by Alexander Lieberman of Betty for the source material for that mosaic. But Betty showed the work, of course, of Reynaud and also Reynaud's husband, Black artist, African-American artist named Tommy Sills, who you should know more about if you don't. And then Hedda Stern, Frankenthaler, and Agnes Martin. Dora Ashton was a prolific author in this time, wrote dozens of books, many of them about the ABEX movement, and published scholarship on Nevelson, Nell, Blaine, and Reynaud. And then Colette Roberts, lower left, she gave Nevelson her first installation show of Blackwood works that filled an entire gallery. It was an amazing show, was featured in Life magazine. And from that point on, Nevelson called herself the grandmother of the environment. And just because a woman was an artist didn't mean that she wasn't also an heiress, a collector, a salon hostess. Women can also wear many hats. So I'm going to read you a little bit about Jean Reynaud here, who was all of those things. The first quote comes from Reynaud herself. She says, "It was an intimate boiling pot too, my house in those days. Many times, rather drained physically, I would be reminded of Oscar Wilde's words, people who think they have a salon end up running a saloon. But I never really had a saloon problem, thanks to the advent of the club and the proximity of the then famous Cedar Bar, into which many a brawl would spill over. To this day, I'm always touched when friends like Harold Rosenberg, Elaine and Bill De Kooning, David Ware, Barney Newman, Mark Rothko remind me of the conversations in my house." And this shows yet again that a woman could be the hostess, but also it was men and women, artists and dealers, critics like Harold Rosenberg, all being together in a social network that supported these women's art. Elaine De Kooning, who met Reynaud in 1950, also gushed in an interview about going to Reynaud's parties. She says, "Jean Reynaud gave the most superb parties. She'd have perhaps 18 people and have drinks before dinner, wonderful luxurious drinks, and wine with dinner and drinks after dinner." Pardon me? And the walls were covered with Gorkies, and then she had a superb painting by Mark Rothko, and later she bought some paintings of Willems. Now, another woman who was supporting women's art was Dorothy Sieberling, a writer for Life magazine. She wrote the article, Women Artists in Ascendance, and you'll notice this idea of ascendance on the rise, a theme that returns to our exhibition today. In 1957, she covered 5 artists. You see 3 of them here, Jane Wilson, Nell Blaine, and Helen Frankenthaler. Now, I love this because you can see the large scale of their paintings, their bold abstraction, their bold colors, but the way that they're depicted as women is certainly not in the act of working or networking. So in response, they kind of look more like models than artists, but in response, what I wanted to do is a photo essay of some women at work in their studio, at work networking, making connections, all to keep women artists on the rise. And you see in the upper left, Nevelson teaching in Amarillo. And I've published elsewhere, and I really think it's an important theme that women artists, one of the jobs that they could get to supplement their incomes was teaching, whether itinerant teaching like Nevelson did, formal teaching, she also did that, teaching at kind of short-term university gigs. This idea of how to create a network, one of the important ways women did this is through teaching. So that's a theme that I want to kind of highlight. You see down below, Elaine De Kooning going on hikes in Palo Duro Canyon in a white pantsuit. Why would anyone do that? But she was getting out there with Dord Fitz's students and enjoying herself, right? This idea of being part of a community. Same with Nevelson in the upper right, going on tours of Oldham County ranches. Maybe it doesn't sound like that much fun, but that's what we do around here, right? We go out and do ranch tours and go to the canyon and hike. And then we see Jeanne Reynaud at work in her studio down below in a photograph by Rudy Burkhart, but that idea of a woman at work rather than a woman being a model in her own studio. Now, this is one of my favorite contrasts. Bonnie and I really work on this contrast in our book. The idea that too often men have enjoyed the lion's share of these support networks of critics like Clement Greenberg writing about them, or Hans Nemeth, the photographer, doing a series of photographs and films about them at work, like Hans Nemeth's here on Pollock. And yet also we have similar photographs of someone like Jeanne Reynaud at work. They just have not become as famous, but they're there, right? So here is Reynaud working on the floor like Pollock, working on all over abstraction like Pollock, but she does it as a woman. You can see she's in a skirt. You can see she has a barrette in her hair. This idea of, how is she embodying her gender at the same time she's challenging stereotypes of her gender? This all deserves more attention. So on that note, I want to close with the call to follow in the footsteps of all of these historical women that I've mentioned and place your bets on women artists. You won't regret it. Thank you.
There, now I'm unmuted. The joys of Zoom.
I wondered about that, but I don't think I can see you. I need to put back on. There we go. Okay.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was an incredible presentation. The imagery, both of the artwork and the historical photos that you have found are just incredible, and I really enjoyed seeing them. One of the themes that you talk about, particularly in your area, is this regional support of women supporting women, but in general, this, regional artists and regional donors. And it just makes me wonder, I didn't know this story, how many more of these stories are out there that we don't know about with regard particularly to women artists? Do you have any sense of, have you run across other people looking at particular regions or other regional stories that you have found interesting?
Yes, there's some very wonderful work going on out of the Nora Eccles Harris Museum in Utah. And then also, Bonnie and I covered in my work the Nebraska context, because one of Reynaud's major commissions was to do mosaics at the state capitol in Lincoln. And she found a very supportive network of people who were willing to stand up for her when there were some people who did not like the style of her mosaics because they didn't find it realist enough. It didn't tell the story in the way that they wanted to celebrate their local histories. And so she really got some pushback from the governor and other people, but there was this incredibly supportive community that threw in behind her. So, I mean, those are just two examples, but one of the things that I think we take for granted is that the stories come out of LA or Chicago or New York, but I don't think that's always the case. And one of the things that Bonnie and I are really working on is kind of highlighting new regions that can tell us stories about women's art or modern art. Another one, it's not about women's artists, but is Oklahoma. Louise Siddons has done some excellent work on She calls it Centering Modernism, her book, and it's about a male artist, but in the Oklahoma context. So yeah, I think it's up and coming. I think there's more work being done in this vein, but I think that is a new trend, that it's exciting, you know, getting outside of the urban centers and finding what else is out there.
I agree. And for us as a national and Canadian organization, we have artists from Canada. It just makes me really think about how much information is out there that we would love to have about these communities that are supporting women artists historically or currently, because we would love to have a presence there, obviously. So I think it's really important, and I appreciate you sharing those. And I think it's an area that we would love to learn a lot more about, all of these regions doing that work, because that really struck me. Thank you for that. Another theme that I find really interesting, and maybe you could touch on this a little bit, when you look at many of the artists that you show that have been in some of these all women shows, there are quite a few that are doing abstract work, quite a few that are labeled surrealists. Do you have a sense of why that would be in those shows? Was that deliberate? Are those artists just getting more of the attention at that time? Do you have anything you could enlighten me about with that?
So I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but it's something that you bring out a good point of, and I made a sort of slight point about it, but the stylistic variations in these shows is pretty gripping. And I think what it shows is just how diverse women's art has been over time. I mean, we have women artists that are working 3D and 2D. We have women artists that are, you know, working kind of that juxtaposition of all over abstraction and then that slightly rumpled realism. I just love that.
I love that.
And I think that at least in that context, those women had to push back on, you know, male critics like Greenberg saying that you were either avant-garde if you did all over abstraction, or you were kitsch, right? Like there were only two categories. And I think that women kind of said, and Elaine De Kooning, we talk about this in our article on Elaine and also in our book, she threw that out the window in her own way because she was also a critic. So she was arguing against some of those biases that she was arguing directly against Greenberg in her writing and in her work, right? Because a lot of her work is figural, even if it's highly abstract. So this idea that, you know, women were willing to push those boundaries because those boundaries had been so constricting. So they were always pushing boundaries. So they pushed boundaries stylistically, they pushed boundaries in the way they performed their gender. They pushed boundaries, like when you look at the 9th Street show that Mary Gabriel covers, their works were the biggest at the show. And it wasn't just a women's show, it was women and men, but they were kind of like, okay, I'm going to go big and bold because why not? Why not, right? So I totally didn't answer your question, but I think, and you said surrealism. So even with, I was struck when looking at this because I thought that the 31 artists that Peggy Guggenheim did were mostly figural, mostly surrealist. But then those 3 that I pulled up were so abstract. And Hedda Stern was there, and so was Louise Nevelson, who was kind of surrealist at the time, but she's also so abstract. I think these categories have always been more fluid. I think that we, as scholars, want to put them in boxes, and they don't fit. So let's not try to put them in boxes.
Right. I love that. Thank you. It just really stood out as I was looking at all of those images. You're right. There's no one woman's style, obviously, but it was interesting, particularly in those time frames of seeing these surreal, quote unquote, or abstract or hard to put into a box works. And I found that really interesting that they were willing to challenge categories, challenge expectations. I think that was great. I loved your point about showing women artists more as models in those photos. And I'm not sure we all would notice that particularly, but you pointed it out so well, while, you know, because we're so used to that maybe, like it or not, but then, you know, contrasting that with them working. And so have you found more examples of that, or, you know, in other, you showed it sort of around that one show. How do you think that's been a trend? Is it still a trend that you see women artists portrayed differently in their media presence than men?
Well, what I'm going to comment on to that is an example of a later artist, a feminist artist, Hannah Wilke. And she was actually told that like she was doing performance pieces that involved her body, and she was told that her body was too beautiful and was distracting from the seriousness of her pieces, right? So, and she kind of played into that. So how does a woman, you know, the expectations of the body of the woman has to read one way, and how does the work of the woman read another way? And I mean, Cindy Sherman plays through this too, right? So, and in really controversial ways, or Ana Mendieta using their own body and not doing it in a way that's beautiful, but challenging. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of examples of women, or even, oh gosh, Linda Benglis and that work that she did in an art magazine, I think it's Art Journal, where she shows her body all greased up with a sexual object, right? And so she's sort of like, oh, men can be in charge of this, well, why can't I? And so that idea of like grabbing that problem by the horns in their art, I think there's a lot of examples of that. But then again, are you gonna, if you're one of those artists in Life magazine, are you gonna argue with the photographer when they wanna show you the way they wanna show you, right? So how much agency do you have and how much agency do you not have?
Right, and we could talk all day how social media has changed that, but traditional media, I think you're right. The image of the artist and how that feeds into their career is forever. I have time for one more question with just you, and then we'll talk more at the roundtable. So I know that teaching is very important to you and a passion for you, and kudos for that. But I would love to hear your perspective. I know you're teaching art history and gender studies, and you're looking at equity with capital E and across different topics. But I always, because I'm older, like to kind of know what's on the minds of some of your students. Are there trends that you're seeing in what they're interested in learning about at this time?
My students, a lot of my students are not training to be art historians, they're training to be artists. So they really love to learn about contemporary artists and artists that are challenging, you know, the status quo, and artists that they can draw on in their own work. And that's one of the things that we really push in our program, is that the point of learning art history is to be in dialogue with the people who are working right now and who worked before you, because nothing comes from nowhere. And all of these women were very much aware of each other and aware of their predecessors. So this idea of awareness. But I think even I think that the students today are really open to gender fluidity. And so, you know, I don't have only, when I'm teaching about women artists, I don't have only women in my classrooms. They're very open to the idea of the spectrum of gender or the spectrum of race, or, you know, my students are hungry for ideas of challenging normal, you know, and the way, but I always do it through artists. And I love to talk about how does this artist challenge normal, rather than me and any kind of political stance that I would have. I always talk through what the artist is saying, and that works pretty well. I haven't had a lot of students, and I live in a very conservative area, but my students want to learn about those artists for what they're saying, like human to human, you know?
Right.
And so I don't have a lot of pushback on like, oh, why are you always teaching about women artists? Or why are, you know, I don't really have that in my classes, and other places on campus are dealing with that, but not in my classes. They're very hungry for artists that challenge, artists that make us think, artists that are exciting and showing things that are not so easy to digest sometimes, you know, but my students don't. They love it. They want more.
That's fantastic. And that's a great topic. We'll talk a little bit more later when we all come back together about this concept of women artists, period. And what that means in a modern world. Right. So I appreciate that very much. Well, thank you, Amy. This has been fantastic. And we will see you back in a little while. Thank you so much. Thank you. And next, I think we're ready. Yes, we're all ready. This part will be really exciting too, because we've heard from an academic person who has also worked with museums and written a lot, to someone who's had an incredible career as a museum director. And now another very important piece of that triangle, if you will, are collectors. We're so pleased and excited to have you all here today. So next we have Steven Bennett and Dr. Elaine Schmidt. And our working artists, as I mentioned earlier, will be familiar with you as collectors of art by women, of women, and as well as the Bennett Prize, which I know you're going to talk a little bit more about, which is such a generous way and something AWA believes in, of trying to support women to have the chance to do more work. And obviously a financial grant to do that does that very well. So I will turn it over to you all. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be here. As we were watching, the doc and I were remarking about how Amy and Bill's remarks are dovetailing so much with some of the things we have to say. We also have to compliment our joint taste. They mentioned Doris Lee, Peggy Bacon, and Elaine De Kooning. We're pleased to say we have all three of those women in the Bennett collection, which, as you know, is a combination of paintings and an amalgam of paintings of women by women. The only paintings we collect are paintings authored by women, and the subjects are women. And I'm going to share my screen if I could, and I'm going to show you some of the works that are in the collection. And so, how is that? Do we have a shared screen yet? Can you see?
I had to unmute myself, but yes, I can see it just fine. It looks great.
You see the title slide? Great.
Yes.
So our topic today is collecting and celebrating American figurative women figurative realist painters. Our entire collection is composed of figurative realists, although it's broadly interpreted. The Americans comprise well over half of the several hundred paintings we own. And most of those painters are alive today. We will reference mostly Americans today. There may be one or two places where we venture off the page, but I don't think much. This is legalese. All this says is this is a Creative Commons license. It says you can repeat with attribution anything we say, but we may not own the reproduction rights to some of the works that are here. So if you're going to reproduce the works, you might want to proceed to obtain your own permissions.
So in order to describe our collection, we've been collecting a little over 10 years, and we made the decision to collect figurative realism, and we wanted all of the works to be done by women painters and the subjects to be women or girls. And so it's of women by women. About 75% of the artists are living and about 25% are historic. And as Steve said, mostly but not entirely Americans. We have about 200 objects in our collection, and our earliest painting is a Gentileschi, and it was done in about 1640. And the most recent painting was just completed this year. We still actively collect. The largest painting in our collection is 84 inches by 120 inches. We have maybe three, including a diptych, paintings that are that large. We have the diptych, 71 by 213 inches. It's by Catherine Longhurst. And the biggest painting in one panel is by Leah Chapin. The smallest painting is a Mary Cassatt, and it's 7 inches by 5 inches. And they think it's a pochade of she was preparing to do a larger painting. Never happened, but we have the pochade. And as I said earlier, we have about 80 living artists, 25 deceased. And people usually ask, do you have multiple paintings by the same artists? And we do for some of the artists. We have 14 paintings by Katie O'Hagan, who is a Scottish artist who lives in New York City. And If you go to our website, you can see we really love her work and her palette.
So frequently when we when we give presentations, we're asked, why do we collect women? Well, here are the reasons. First of all, we like the work and we like the people. We like figurative realism, but it's fair to say that our interpretation of what that means is fairly broad. We decided to collect women in part because we wanted to support women painters and show what they're capable of. And the collection is really trying to index a little slice of art history in the sense that it's only women and it's only subjects, the only subjects are women. And then, of course, every collection is a reflection of the vision of the collectors. And so part of what we're doing is to show people what turns us on. So you see that certainly in the collection itself. Another important thing, and to be mentioned here, and all of the illustrations that you're seeing in these slides are paintings in the collection. So the slide here shows Sarah Miriam Peale. She was the niece of Charles Wilson Peale. This is a mother and daughter painting dated 1848, about the time that she moved to St. Louis. The painting, I think, demonstrates one of the things that we look for, though, when we're seeking to add work to our collection, and that is that you get a response, an emotional response or a visual response is engendered by the work. And the other thing from almost all the work that we collect is that there be a significant visual impact, call it oomph, that drives someone to look at the work and to continue to study it. And so we think this is an example of that. I think if we go back one, any one of the paintings that are shown on slide 6 are paintings that are in the collection, and they all, I think, reflect our commitment to having some oomph, emotional responses and oomph in the work.
So our collection is a combination of both old and new. And for the first 5 or 6 years, we only collected contemporary paintings. And then at a certain point, it became obvious that if we were going to help the careers of the women who are still alive and in our collection, that if we added to the gravitas of our collection by adding historic women, that it would help the living artists. So as Steve's going to talk about later on, I mean, we're very aware that current work is based upon the foundation that are the historic artists. As Amy referred to earlier, you have to learn the classics before you can go off on your own. So the painting on the left is by Candice Bohannon, and she painted this gem, Hannah's daughter, in 2015, and it's 8 inches square and is oil on copper, and she does quite a bit oil on copper. The second painting is one of my favorites. It's a painting done by Mary Cassatt, and it's her portrait of Mrs. Alfred Sisley. Now, actually, she wasn't Mrs. Sisley at the time. He didn't choose to marry her until she was dying 25 years later, but they called it the portrait of Madame Sisley. The third one is, the painting on the right is by Agnes Martin. She's well known for her grid paintings. And she did this of her lover, Daphne Vaughn, while she was a student at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And this is one of a half dozen surviving paintings done in a realist style before Agnes discovered the grid. Now, Agnes had mental health issues, and they're well documented. So after she discovered the grid, she decided she was going to collect all of her earlier works, all of the realist works, and destroy them because she wanted that part of her work obliterated. She was only going to be known for the grid. And she approached, the story goes, she approached Daphne, who would not give it to her. And apparently there are between 6, 8, 14 paintings that she didn't destroy in a bonfire, though she wanted to get rid of them all.
Right. That's also quite true. That's yours.
All right. We not only have to deal with Zoom, we have to figure out who's going to.
We have to deal with each other.
So we have notes.
Yes.
Okay. This is a montage of works by living American women painters, and all of them are practicing today. Top left is Anne Tanksley, an African-American artist from the DC area. She is 88 years old, lucid, wonderful painter, and still working today. The next painting over with the barn is Andrea Couch. She's a rustic realist from Central Michigan who paints these wonderful, challenging rural scenes that are often filled with tension and wonder. And I asked her, I said, so is the girl running to something or running from something? And she said, I'm going to leave that up to you. So, the little girl sitting with her legs crossed is done by Katie O'Hagan. She typically uses a Payne's gray palette and creates landscapes that are reminiscent of her native Scotland. And she did 2 works. She has 2 daughters. And as they were about to become adolescents, she did a work of each of them, and this is one of her daughters. We are fortunate not to have both of the paintings, and we have them hanging in our dining room next to a self-portrait by Katie, so it's kind of like a little family affair in there. Then we have Candace Bohannon on the far right, depicting a deaf blind girl who is she was like an animal whisperer. And this young lady was a friend of the artist, still is, I'm imagining. And the painting won the National Portrait Society's Best Portrait Award 7 years ago. Then we have, if you go kind of clockwise, Susanna Nahn, an artist from Baltimore, and she did the circus scene a couple years ago. And then back on the very left, the classic piece is done by a New York artist, Patricia Watwood. She's more of a traditional figure painter, and she did the picture of Pandora with a dystopic New York City in the background and the Beatrice of the computer age. You probably can't see it from that slide, but she's got all the rubbish laying around Pandora.
So we have paintings that are famous and some that aren't famous but will be. This is another example of some of the paintings in the collection. Starting on the left, that's Elaine De Kooning. Her portrait of the abstract expressionist sculptor Ibram Lassaw's daughter, Denise. And if you're interested in that painting, on our website, I found Denise at the time we acquired the painting. Denise is in her 70s, and she's had a varied and very exciting life. And she told the story of how Elaine had come back from shopping and had jelly beans, and she decided she would paint a portrait of Denise, said, "Take off your clothes." And Denise said, "I slathered my nipples and my crotch." That's her words. "I slathered my nipples and my crotch with jelly beans, and darn it, Elaine didn't put them in the painting." So shucks. The painting in the center is by Harmonia Rosales. She's living and working today. I think she's in California, Los Angeles area. It's the Annunciation, as you can see, and Harmonia is well known for doing religious scenes that have African-American protagonists in them. The painting on the far right above is, I think it's a self-portrait by Alicia Brown, who at the time was an NYAA student. The painting in the lower right is by Sylvia Sleigh, S-L-E-I-G-H. Sylvia was one of the few true figurative realists working in the 50s and 60s. At one point she said, you know, I had to paint what I knew, and it was pretty lonely out there in the 50s and 60s when everybody else was abstract expressionist, but I stayed with it. The sitter is Elaine Dufour, who is still alive today, and I've had a lovely conversation with her as well.
I think you should mention about the title.
Oh, the title of the title of the painting in the lower right is called Portrait of Elaine Dufour. And Elaine says, well, wait, I was a student at Pratt, and shucks, the model didn't show up, and I got drafted to take off my clothes, and I wasn't sitting for a painting. I expected it to be a figure study with no name on it. Now I'm stuck, you know. Art history has assigned this as Portrait of Elaine Dufour, and it has, actually. The painting is well known among a subset of collectors, and so Elaine's name is forever identified with the painting, but I don't think she had expected it to be so.
What, she didn't think it was a portrait?
Yeah, she did not think it was a portrait, or didn't expect it to be a portrait. The diptych on copper is by Erin Anderson, a Pennsylvania artist working today. She paints these wonderful classical figure painting on a black ground, and then she uses a Dremel moto tool to incise the copper to create these really extraordinary designs. And as you can see, it's a very striking work. The painting on the far left, of course, is Gertrude Abercrombie. Gertrude was a Chicago painter, kind of a surrealist painter who worked in the 50s and 60s in Chicago. She's also known, the African-American people, artists, musicians at the time nicknamed her the Queen of Bop, and she was very well known among that group of 1950s jazz artists. So we thought, since we assume the audience is largely artists, we thought we might take a minute to give some advice. One of our first pieces of advice, unsolicited advice. My wife says I'm capable of giving unsolicited advice, so we're going to give some. And our first thought is, you know, study art history and pursue the work of the classical masters, because it really informs what you do. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's always this question of, do you do pretty paintings that are figurative, or do you do narrative paintings that tell a story? And frankly, Artsy did a survey a couple of years ago that talked about figuration versus narration. And most collectors that responded, at least to this Artsy survey, said they liked paintings that tell a story. Being visual is not enough. There has to be enough content in the painting to cause one to tell themselves a story or to wonder at a story in the work. The other advice we have is, as we became collectors, we found that many artists, particularly if they're not represented by galleries, don't track their work and their prices. They don't have a historical, a linear timeline that describes their work and their pricing and their evolution. And we think that's a real bad thing, and urge you to figure out a way, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, figure out a way to track your work and your prices. Now, this painting on the left, it's a lovely painting. It's called Grandmother's Birthday. It's by a deceased African-American woman named Georgette Seabrook Powell. The photograph doesn't really do it justice. It has this marvelous impasto on it. We have assumed that the artist's mother is the central figure eating the cake, and that the granddaughter is the artist's daughter in the upper left-hand corner. That's speculation, but closely tracks at least the narrative we've invented for the painting. So in terms of studying the art history and pursuing the classical masters, you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And so we think Artemisia, this is a painting in our collection. Her self-portrait is Cleo. There's a lot of argument. There are a half dozen art historians who've written about this painting. And the dates go from 1625 to 1645 or thereabouts. And there's a lot of argument about it, but it's clearly an allegory, self-portrait as the goddess of history. And I think Artemisia is a great place to start. She and I think Bill mentioned Lavinia Fontana. She and Lavinia Fontana are kind of the great grandmothers of women painters who were women painters in their own right and who had recognition in their own names during their lifetimes. So our advice is observe the work of these women and emulate it, practice it, master it. And once you've mastered it, then you can pursue your own vision, building on what you've learned. And if you look at the evolution of, look at the evolution of Agnes Martin. She may not have wanted anybody to know it, but she mastered realist painting, and then she went to the grid. And if you look at the Blue Guitar by Picasso, he mastered the ability to do true figurative realism before he moved into his abstract portion of his career.
So as Steve mentioned earlier, one of the great debates when we have the Bennett Prize jury is the question of pure figuration versus narrative. Does it have to have a story behind it? And although every juror answers the question differently, as collectors, we tend to favor paintings that say something. A well-executed drawing is the starting place for us, but not the finishing line. And we want some oomph or hook or something. The other thing that I think is interesting, and if you're practicing artist worth considering, is that women, I know Amy talked about wealthy women who collected art before, but I think the trend for the future is that as women, their careers are taking off, as we know. 51% of all managers in America in 2019 before the pandemic were women. There's more wealth that's being controlled by women, and the millennials, I'm a baby boomer, where women are, the millennial women compared to where we as a group were incredibly different in terms of personal wealth. And so that I believe that more and more of the buyers are going to be women and women alone. And if you look at the demographic of women 65 and older, half of them are single and they control their own money. So women like relationships. If you look at the research, they are way more into relationships. Generally, everything's a generalization when you talk globally. So I think that if you want to sell your paintings, you have a narrative so that people can get hooked and have some kind of relationship to the paintings. Okay, back to my slide here. The painting is by Leigh Price. She's a living New York artist who specializes in self-portraits with bathtubs and food. She has painted herself on the bed with butter, cheese, and crackers. I just saw a new painting she posted yesterday. She had food on the bed again.
Is she back to the bed?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Great work.
And what she does is they're all self-portraits. Her husband takes photos of her, and then she paints from the photos.
cookies, lemons,
Cookies, and-
sundaes.
And we like this painting because my mother had a tea set just like that with a little rose in it.
So in terms of practical advice for artists, tracking your work and your prices is essential. And although you can do it kind of with a pen and a pencil, I think Excel as a tool is really important and something that every artist should learn how to use. And you need to track your pieces chronologically by piece, by square inch, how big are they, how much are you getting per square inch, and make a high-res photo of every piece of work you create and catalog them on a computer. And if you can't, have somebody who can. The other part about it is know where your pieces are. Someday, if you are lucky enough to have a retrospective show, somebody's going to say, well, that's a great painting. Let's put it in the show. And you might be in a situation where you don't know where it is. So know where the babies are being raised. One of the things we're always immensely interested in and amazed at is we've purchased a lot of paintings. We purchase on average 10 to 15 paintings a year. And sometimes we buy from galleries, sometimes we buy at auctions, sometimes we buy directly from an artist if she doesn't have a gallery. And what's interesting is that the galleries do an average job. 1 in 3 will stay in touch. The auction houses are always there with the next thing. And the artists, once you buy a piece from them, you never hear from them again. Or if you hear from them, you hear from them once. And you say, that piece isn't quite for us. And they're so wounded by the rejection, you never hear from them again. And so our suggestion is stay in touch with your collectors. Now, the painting on the left is by Carrie Pierce. It's called Horse Feathers. Carrie Pierce is an artist. I think she lives in Peoria. A graduate of SCAD, and she specializes in finding photographs that are abandoned, usually from the late 19th century or the early 20th century, and then she turns them into these magic realistic things. And so this was derived from a photograph around the turn of the century in which the sitter is actually in a photo studio next to a little horse on wheels holding this whip made out of a deer's hoof, which was apparently very popular at the time. And so this is her creative and expressive recreation of it. And sorry you don't get to see the actual work because it's really quite striking.
So as we were collecting, we like to talk to the artist, find out the ideas they had behind the paintings or anything that would help us contextualize the pieces we acquire. And as we did so, it became very clear that men and women, they all have challenges. However, there seemed to be a lot of women raising children alone. It was very difficult for women to be full-time artists. And so Steve and I, we thought, well, beyond just buying their pieces, what could we do? And we started to talk to each other, and then we talked to some professionals we know in the business, gallerists and artists and museum people. And we came up with a prize that is called the Bennett Prize. And it was established in 2018. It has 2 goals. First, to propel the careers of women figurative realist painters. And secondly, to bring in appreciation for figurative realism to new generations of viewers and collectors. This painting was done by the first Bennett Prize winner, Annika Ingold. She's a painter and a professor of art from Tampa, Florida. This work is mixed media on paper, which was then mounted on dye bond before it was framed. Now, this is from my husband, but I will say it.
Go ahead.
There are certain things he doesn't like chalk, hard to deal with. Paper, he says, by the way, we don't recommend that painters work on paper. It's a curatorial challenge to keep the paint on the paper and the paper from falling apart. And most collectors don't like to collect paper for paintings. And it's true, if you're going to paint on paper, they're harder to sell. And
by golly, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Oh, you're good.
All right.
You're still talking about the Bennett Prize, aren't you?
Okay, so here are some details. It's awarded every 2 years. We're just starting the third cycle. Any woman painter who lives in the United States and has not sold a painting for $25,000 or more is eligible. Competition is judged by a jury of 4, and it's a different jury every time. So if you don't get chosen one time, a different jury might be looking for just what you do, so don't be discouraged. 2 practicing women artists and a museum or gallery professional, and then Steve on the jury. And this painting on the left was done by the second winner of the Bennett Prize, Ayanna Ross of McDonough, Georgia. It's oil on canvas. She often works from photographs, and she had a history in textiles, and you can see that in her background. At the time when she won the prize, she was a full-time high school art teacher and painting on the side. The prize was awarded last May, and this year she is painting full-time with her own studio in Atlanta. So we are absolutely thrilled that the money has enabled her to do that, live into her dreams.
We might mention that the practicing women artists who are the jurors this time around are Zoe Frank from who's now in Colorado, a wonderful, wonderful painter, and the well-known fantasy artist Julie Bell, who is a very well-known kind of magical realist. And so we're very excited for the vision of these 2 women to flavor the jury this time. Our museum professional is Joseph Rosa, who is the director of the Fry Museum in Seattle. So we're very excited. So as far as the prize itself, the winner gets $50,000 over a 2-year period. And at the end, we'll have a traveling exhibition of her work, separate but traveling with the show of the next succeeding iterations finalists. So at the end of the 2 years, we pick 10 more finalists, and the preceding winner has a 1-woman show that travels alongside the exhibition of the finalists' work. The winner, gets $50,000, as I said. And this year, for the first time, we will have 1 runner-up, a first runner-up, if you will, who will receive a cash prize of $10,000. In addition, we give an all-expense-paid trip to the 10 finalists with a guest to attend the show to see the exhibition of their work in Muskegon, Michigan, where our host museum does the opening. Usually opens in May in Muskegon and runs through the summer, and then the show travels. Currently, as you know, it's in Clarksville, Tennessee at the Customs House, running concurrently with the AWA exhibition, which is a wonderful show. We're very excited about the fact that those 2 shows could be side by side. It's very exciting. And you talk about figurative realism. Well, what is figurative and what is real? The painting on the left is in the Bennett collection. It's by Susu Susu is an artist living in Pittsburgh. She was a finalist for the most recent completed iteration of the Bennett Prize. Her work's on the wall in Clarksville, I believe. Susu has taken off like a rocket. She was recently placed in the Dela Cruz collection in Miami, which is a very important private collection. And she lectured at the Dela Cruz collection during Art Basel Miami in the first week of this past December. So this is an example. One of the things we've said is that our goal is to promote women. And so if you're a finalist for this prize, our goal is to see you succeed. And the highest compliment we can be paid is to say, oh, that finalist for the Bennett Prize, we can't afford her anymore.
And you might mention that for all 10 finalists for that 2-year period, we pay for a lot of PR, both social media and print, because our goal is really to try to propel as many careers as we can. So that's what we do for all 10 finalists.
Good. You want to cover this?
No, you go right ahead. This is yours.
All right. Call for entries for the 2023 iteration of the Bennett Prize opens on April 18th. It'll close on October 7th. Submissions must include at least three recent works, a detailed shot from the work, and a bio. And if you want all of the details are available at thebennettprize.org. So there's those dates, thebennettprize.org. And if you're interested in the Bennett collection, www.thebennettartcollection.com. So thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. We did have, I want to ask you a couple questions quickly, but we did have a few come through on chat. So there was a question again about your parameters, if you've ever thought about, as you've been collecting, going beyond figurative, and if you've ever thought about adding sculpture. So I think our artists would love to hear your thinking.
Well, actually, we have thought about going beyond figurative, only because we like all kinds of art. We like glass. We do like sculpture. And actually, we like a lot of work done by men. And we just decided that for us to have a well-defined collection that has one or two strong messages was our goal. And so, yes, we've thought about it, but conceptually, it didn't fit with what our ultimate mission is what I would say.
Well, it makes collecting a lot easier if you have gardens too. I mean, I can flip through a catalog and I can admire a lot of work that doesn't fit, but if you have collecting parameters and you enforce them, it makes it very easier to create an aggregation. So we've been very tempted by a lot of work by abstractionists and sculptors and so forth. As far as sculpture is concerned, we have absolutely no hang-ups about it. It's just that, to use an ugly phrase, you have to pick the hill you're going to die on. And so the hill we've chosen to die on is two-dimensional painting.
And we have one sculpture, and it is done by a woman.
Yes, we have one piece. But it's done by a woman.
Well, and it's a great point. I think a lot, again, people that might not have worked in museums, that's the challenge for museums too. You have a very strict collecting policy. It gets debated constantly. We will collect this. We won't collect this. Here's the reason why. And so otherwise, as you know, as you said, you get tempted, or there's not enough storage, let's be frank, that you have to put this sort of container around what you're going to do. So thank you for those questions from our artists. I would like to quickly ask one before we have everybody come back. I always love to hear how collectors started. Had you started buying some pieces and then the idea evolved? Or did you have the idea you wanted to do this and then pursue art? Was it a little of both? I'd love to hear how it sort of came to be.
You love to tell this story. Go ahead.
Steve is a born collector.
Okay.
If it exists and you like cufflinks, pens, watches, stamps, he just loves to collect. And we had
That isn't a put down, is it?
no, it's a description. Because it's accurate, right?
Yeah, right.
It's accurate.
Sure.
I'm not.
It's collecting. She didn't use the word hoarding or anything like that. It's collecting.
But we had a condo in Chicago and there was nothing on the walls. And so we went through brainstorming. Steve made his money to become a lawyer by being a professional photographer. So we had some beautiful photographs he had taken. And, you know, I said, well, we could blow them up and show those. And so we thought about that. And then he likes stamps. So we went through the check stamps, which actually are beautiful. They are works of art in their own right. Blow those up. So we kind of went through stages. And Steve started to read and he figured out quite aptly at the time, it would be different now, I think. The very first Women Painting Women show out of the Principal Gallery in Alexandria, Virginia had just happened, that you could get wonderful work done by women for less money. So we could get more, and we could also, we're into equity, not just with art, but in other parts of our life too. And that's a big thing for both of us. You could also promote women. Mm-hmm. And so, and we both like figurative realism because we both like the story. And that's how we got started. And we had different points. We started to buy, like you said, we just started to buy. Steve said he realized he was a collector when we ran out of wall space.
There you go.
And I realized we were a collector when I was looking at Facebook one Saturday morning, and we had seen a painting online done by an Australian artist, Diane Gall. And he said, do you like this painting? And I had said, yes, I like this painting. So then I see on her Facebook site, my painting, everybody knows, has been purchased by the Bennett collection of women realists in America. I'm so excited. And I thought, okay, I'm a collector when it's posted on Facebook before he even says to me, oh, by the way, I bought that painting.
I bought that. Oh, that is a great story.
Yeah, so that's
well, and that's a great point, that other people will start calling you a collector maybe before you do. That's fascinating. We could have a whole talk about this. So thank you. Yeah, let's invite our other speakers back. And I have a few questions that I would love to ask all of you and have a bit of a conversation. Welcome back. Thank you, all of you. This has been great. And as I said, as I listened to all of you and I was able to preview your slides, there were some interesting themes, and I'm sure the viewers are seeing that too. So I thought we could talk together, and if you want to ask questions of each other, that's fine. But the first question I would love to ask is the concept of going back to women artists, right? So we're the American women artists, and I've worked at another museum where we did an all-woman show. Some people, including artists, don't want to have that label, won't participate necessarily in a show that's all women for lots of different reasons. And then Amy and Bill brought up the idea today of sort of rejecting traditional gender labels, if you will. So I'd love to hear from each of you. Do you think shows that are all about women or organizations that are all about women still have a place? And can you talk about pros or cons just from your perspective? And
want to go in
start
order?
with whoever wants to go first. Sure.
Okay, I'll jump in just in order, but I don't want to take over.
No.
One of the things that I mentioned in my essay for the catalog was a phrase that Holland Cotter wrote in the New York Times about how those kinds of separate shows position women forever as outsiders. kind of separate but unequal. And there's been so many of these shows. I mean, I talked about some historical ones, but recently there've been a lot of them that are, you know, current, like more current. And I just feel like they're really successful and exciting and positive. And so, you know, but then there's a lot of artists that refuse to identify themselves as women artists, O'Keeffe being one of them. So the rumor goes she didn't want to participate in Peggy Guggenheim's 31 Women. She opted out because she didn't want to be a woman artist. She wanted to be an artist. I think there's still a place for them, but I think that the women, the artists can self-identify how they choose. And I feel like all of us can self-identify how we want when we want. And I think that, you know, asking someone, how do you see yourself, is better than telling them how they're seen. So I'll leave it at that.
That's a great point. Bill, do you want to add to that?
Sure. It's probably an unpopular and contrary to what I actually think, but I'm going to say I'm pro all women artist shows, particularly at the moment, because I think that women artists are still not free from prejudice, they're not free from condescension, and they're not free from discrimination. And so consequently, if you look at the Woodstock colony as an example, where women were able to band together and to talk and to be with each other in discussions, that was a very successful experiment, which continues to this day. But something that makes me say I'm profoundly pro is because we are trying to organize an exhibition right now of Japanese women ceramicists. And
Excellent.
I was warned from the beginning that it will be controversial. And why should it be controversial? But apparently Japanese women do not have the same standard or do not have the same standing as male artists in Japan. And so it has been an interesting attempt to try to organize this exhibition and the resistance that we're getting from men. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a place for all women shows because, as I said, women are not free from prejudice or discrimination even now in the year 2022.
Thank you. I have a feeling I know the answer from the Bennett collection in particular, but I would love to hear your opinion about, as you mentioned, I'm so pleased both of our exhibitions are happening at the same time and are overlapping of all women. So Customs House is filled with women artists, but I'd love to hear your opinion about the pros or cons of it.
Anytime you create an aggregation based on identity, whether it pick anything, you know, gender could be one, or race, or national origin, or this sort of thing. Anytime you create an aggregation like that, you are creating a ghetto. And so I think I understand quite clearly the resistance of the women who want to be thought of as great artists and not great women artists. You know, some years ago, Mike Wallace asked Frank Lloyd Wright while he was still alive, he said, comment on the fact that you've been described as the greatest living architect. And he said, I have a problem with that qualifier, living. And but I think I won't speak for you. I'm with Bill. There's a place for it. And I want to give a plug. The DIA, this is backwards probably. The DIA has a show going now, the Detroit Institute of Art, called By Her Hand, Artemisia and the Women Artists in Italy from 1500 to 1800. It's a great show. This is the catalog for it. It's a fabulous thing. And in these transitional times, I think it's fully appropriate to have shows that are built around identity aggregation, for lack of a better phrase.
But I would just add, as an educator, you know, you assume if you hear women's art, women shows, women artists, that it's lesser. And I think we've got to start teaching our children. It could mean it's better, right? People always assume the worst. And until we can kind of break through those assumptions and start teaching, no, it could mean they're just as good, or it can mean it's better. And sometimes, frankly, not all women's work is great, just like not all men's work is great. So you have to start changing those immediate thought patterns that people have when they hear phrases like that, because it's really not the women artists, it's the audience and how they interpret the language that they're hearing.
Right.
I think that's a great point. And I think Bill made a great point. Again, when you sort of lift the veil to understand the workings of museums, you know, we can be quick to say, oh, museums don't do enough shows about women. But the public doesn't see all of the back end conversations that are going on. And I think that's a really important point. Directors don't have as much power as some people might think they do to unilaterally make choices about shows or collection items. So I think that's a really important point to bring up. The next question I wanted to hear all of you speak about. So Amy talked about the idea of placing your bets on women artists, right? And I used to live in Vegas, so I love that. Place your bets. And, you know, looking at it as an investment, although I found it very interesting reading about the Bennett collection. You've never sold a painting. You are building, you know, an incredible collection. So it's not a fully financial motivation. But if you're thinking about placing your bet on the next exhibition or the next piece of research you would like to do or the next purchase you might consider, can you talk about what factors really drive your interest individually? You know, what you're looking for when you're thinking about next purchase, next paper you might write, next exhibition. When you're thinking about these women artists, what factors rise to the top for you?
For me, it's always something that has to be pretty intriguing, something I can sink my teeth into. There's got to be like a layer upon layer there where it's, and I tell my students this too, you know, pick an artist that you actually want to work on. Why waste your time with something that's not interesting? There's got to be like a passionate commitment to the questions asked. And one of the things I think is interesting, so I've been working on O'Keeffe. I wasn't an O'Keeffe scholar before I moved to Amarillo and started my job at West Texas A&M, and I became one because she worked there. So I had to kind of know about that and started digging in. But what I learned is that it's not just about her as an artist or as a woman, it's what else we can learn from her paintings or her writings that tell us about the historical moment or that tell us about World War I, because she was here during World War I. So to me, it's like you pick something that's a project based on its levels of intrigue, and it has to be multi-leveled. So,
thank you. Bill, would you like to comment on that? You just mentioned a great show that you're thinking about, but what else do you look for in collecting or planning shows?
Well, we can boil it down to one thing, and it's not a popular opinion, but it's a word that is much maligned, particularly by the new theorists of the 21st century, and that is we're looking at quality, and quality is a dirty word. But what we mean by quality is the quality of the thought behind the work, as well as the quality of the work itself. That is for individual works, but it's also for those that we are interested in acquiring, but also those that we're interested in showing. And so if an artist has an aesthetic, an articulated aesthetic, then she is more attractive to us than one who does not.
Amen. Right. Amen.
Yes, you touched on that a little bit, both Steven and Elaine. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more? You mentioned narrative, and do you want to talk a little bit more about what you're looking for?
Quality, I think we resonate with that. I think we resonate with the idea of an aesthetic. Mm-hmm. A piece of advice for a practicing artist is that you're only allowed to get 5 different kinds of work going at the same time or serially within the course of a few years. When you're just starting out and haven't identified an aesthetic, or when you've gotten so good that everybody will buy whatever you make, whether it's the old aesthetic or the new one. That means for the great bulk of practitioners, stick with your aesthetic and don't abandon it. And we know a number of very successful practitioners in their late 30s, early 40s who get struck by lightning and then decide they're going to become impressionists or abstractionists or something else. And I think you undertake that transition only with some trepidation, because you have to be careful that you don't leave the thing that made you successful behind without having some certainty that what you're headed to is sensible.
I think that's a great point. And there are so many examples of artists. Way back when I worked in a gallery, I worked for the artist Alan Hauser, who was an Apache sculptor, and he was very figurative for a while, and then in his older age wanted to just do abstract. And his collectors, and frankly some museums, were not interested and weren't very supportive, and it was very frustrating. So that's really an interesting perspective from both a museum and a collector. You get known and you're successful in one way, but an artist might want to try something else. But I think you said it very well, that it is a business if we're talking about being a professional artist. And so thinking about your audience, whether that's in a museum or for collectors, there is that need for a thread of knowing who you are aesthetically. That's a really great point. I appreciate that one.
Okay.
The next question I'll ask, if you are, those are the sorts of things you're looking for, and this is just out of curiosity, if you had to name sort of your top 2 places you go to find that next person that you might want to research or show, I'm just curious, or collect, what are kind of your first go-tos to go discover?
Well, for me, it seems, I don't know, I feel like I'm starting to be a one-trick pony around here, but in my area, there's way more art than I thought, so it's always in my backyard that I try to discover stuff. And I went to school in Los Angeles, and we had the Getty and LACMA and all these places, but around here we don't have those kinds of art resources. But that doesn't mean there isn't stuff to discover. So turn over some rocks in your own backyard and see what's there.
That's great advice. Bill, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. If I could, I would leave tomorrow. I'd go to Nashville, Tennessee, and I would look at the work by an artist at Fisk University, because I want one for the collection. Mm-hmm. If I had even more money and time, I would go straight to Berlin, because Berlin is the hot spot right now for so-called cutting-edge art. Now, the reason I say so-called is because, as the Bennetts aptly showed in their slide, you've got to know where the cutting edge is before you can be cutting edge. And so I quite agree with them that I am interested most in those artists who do know the history of art and who have arrived at an aesthetic from their knowledge of the history of art and their knowledge of the fundamentals of painting or of printmaking itself. I'm very interested in prints, so I'd go to Chicago and visit some of the galleries in Chicago for printmaking as well.
That's great. Stephen or Elaine, do you have favorite places you go to do some research or make new discoveries?
I would say both of us are listeners and observers. And before the pandemic, we would go to different museums, and typically you'd get through the whole museum and there'd be 4 women artists hung, right? And so we would start following up. In Ireland, we ended up collecting 6 or 8 Irish and Scottish artists
women.
After we had been there, because these were names we didn't know. We were writing down names today. And so
that's great.
Part of what we've been fortunate enough to do is, especially for the historic women, is Steve is really good at figuring out who he thinks might become well-known. And we've been able to acquire some paintings by people that we couldn't afford now, because in the last 5 years, they've gone up. So part of what we do is kind of call those, like Elaine De Kooning, when we bought hers, it's like 4 times as much now, 6 years later. And so it's listening and reading and going, we gallery hop, we museum, we go to museums.
Yeah, I think one thing that's happening though in the current there's a feeding frenzy around women. You still have to have an eye. Everybody wants to buy everything that has a woman's name on it, and there's a lot of middling average work that's for sale out there. Particularly if a woman is dead, there's a tendency to want to jump on it, and all the dealers are buying up everything in these auctions that they think might get traction. They're all trying to anticipate the market. We're still looking for quality pieces that fit within our personal aesthetic as we go about it. And the question becomes, how do you do that? Well, you're always trolling, You read all the art magazines, you look at Artsy, you look at what's going on the internet, you watch Instagram, you pay attention to Artsy, right? But in the end, you have to make a decision based on your aesthetic. Yes, you anticipate the market. Yes, you try and figure out who's going to be big and who's not. But there are some artists that you can just tell instantly they're going to be on fire. And there's a whole series of collectors out there today who, when they figure that out, they buy every single piece the artist produces. They put them in a bear hug. They say, I'll buy every piece of work you create for the next 5 years. Now they're buying them at half or a third of retail probably, but they put I had a conversation with a woman artist a while back, and I said, I really love your work. I'd like to buy one of your paintings. She says, I'm sorry, I'm in an arrangement with a collector where I have to give him first right of refusal for everything I create. And I said, well, don't bother to call me because I don't want the leftovers. And she was quite angry that I would suggest that anything she might offer to me would be a leftover. But this bear hug thing goes on a lot, and it's subliminal to most people. Most people don't see it, but it's there.
That's a great point. And I'm sure the motivation, especially if you're starting, that you have sort of the bird in the hand. Here's somebody who is willing to offer me money and will do so for X amount of time. That can feel better and quicker maybe than having to find a larger group of collectors or work with museums. That's a really interesting concept. I think great advice for artists to think about. We just have a few more minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 questions. And one you've touched on in a few different ways, which is this digital transformation that we've all seen in art, whether we are researchers, whether we're in museums, and whether we're collectors. In particular, that so much more art is available to be seen in a digital way than it was historically. And I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about the pros and cons that you see with digital representation of artwork in its various forms, and whatever comes to mind when I say that, I'd love to hear.
For me, 2 things. One is like how little control we have about sharing and teaching through digital images. I mean, I didn't even think twice about sharing my images and who has permission to do so. But yet when we publish a book, we have to jump through all these hoops and pay all this money to get all this permission. So I think like permissions and copyright is in such interesting flux right now. I'm teaching a class to my grad students on that, and we just talk hours and hours about this complicated thing. The other thing that I don't understand, but I need to, we have a new digital art professor, and she's much more up to date on NFTs and this kind of new, trajectory for an art market that's digital and changing. And I think it's an area where, and she's argued this, where women can make new inroads, but
Interesting.
we have to teach ourselves how. And I'm behind the curve on that, but I think that there's new, trying new avenues of sales or marketing through the digital world. We have to do it because otherwise we fall behind. But I think I actually told her today, and I think she's listening, it's like, we got to sit down and have a conversation about this, because next time I give this talk, I need to talk about that and I need to understand it. So yeah, copyright and NFTs, I think, are things that we need to be thinking about that are in flux.
Very important. Thank you. Bill, from a museum perspective, we can argue seeing the real thing is the goal physically, but obviously museums have adopted so many digital tools, being able to see a collection online and so forth. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my thoughts would be ditto to what Amy just said, but with a little bit of an expansion, and that was the word museum itself derives from the Alexandrian conglomeration of thinkers, philosophers, artists, singers, and that conglomeration is what I like to see in a museum, is thought as well as the object itself. And so consequently, I look at the Museum of Modern Art or at other contemporary museums who define contemporary art as the history of the last 50 years. And I believe that we do need a certain distance before we're able to judge even technological
Interesting.
works. But at the same time, we don't have 50 years to do that. Now we may have 10 years to do it. So we have to stay, as Amy said, we need to sit down with somebody and talk about exactly what it means and how it's going to develop.
And for Elaine and Steven, has it changed how you collect? Have you bought without seeing a piece in person, just online? And then NFTs, would you consider that, I guess, would be the next question.
First of all, we are not afraid to buy paintings based on digital representations, but we buy them with the understanding we can send them back.
Got it.
In the whole history of our collection, we've sent one painting back out of several hundred, and a high-res photo and a couple of in situ shots. And you can get a pretty good, not a perfect, but a pretty good sense of how much art weighs, any given piece, how much it weighs. As far as NFTs go, it's a way of taking a fungible thing that is like every other thing that it is, and infusing it with the numinous character of the original. And so I think it's a new frontier. It's a new frontier. We got to watch it. I'm with Bill. We 50 years, but you only got 10. Amy has 50. You and I, Bill, we have 10 years to figure it out, but Amy has 50 to look back on it. But do I think what's happening in the world today is altering in ways that we cannot actually predict the trajectory of fully? Is digital changing it? It sure is. After all, in the old days, when the old days was 15 years ago, you wouldn't buy a painting any other way than to walk into a gallery or an art studio and say, I'll take that one. It's there's a lot of discussion among brick and mortar gallerists and frankly, brick and mortar museums about whether or not in 100 years they continue to exist as brick and mortar houses, because so much of what's going on now is driven by digital.
But it's always better to see it in person, just like it's
Every time.
always better to hear live music live.
Mm-hmm.
Always, yes. Live music beats a CD anything.
Sandra, there's a art critic who's called me a Neanderthal just precisely because of this. And I think, Stephen, I think I heard him use the word numanism or numanism.
Yeah, numinous.
Humanist or numanism?
Numinous.
Yeah, numinous. So the Kantian definition of numanism is something that I ascribe to, and no token yet, whether fungible or non-fungible, has raised the hair on the back of my neck, like Michelangelo's David.
Well, you and I guess, can be troglodytes together, Bill.
I would agree. I think I'm right in the middle. There's both. I love seeing things online, but it has just been such a transformation even in my lifetime that I have loved having so much more access and, researching collections and seeing things online that I'm hopefully can follow up in person. But it is, I think we could do a whole symposium just on this, and maybe we will. We're a little over, but for my very last question, I thought I would just ask if you were going to give the AWA board and myself one piece of advice on how to continue our mission, particularly how to attract more museums to want to have a show like we have right now. Do you have a piece of advice for us?
I think it's, you guys are doing it already, but it's this kind of just what I was showing with the images of social networking, not just like social online networking. So we're back to the idea of like, do we do it in person or not? And I think that this kind of Zoom world is wonderful insofar as I'm not able to travel to be with you in person, but I'm able to do this today through online things. But there's something about a museum opening in person when everyone's there, or a gallery opening in person where you meet new people, you see old people. Like, art is a social practice, and I don't think it'll ever not be. And so I know we shouldn't just spend money on parties, but why not make it fun? And I think that the more fun you have, the more people get to know each other. The more people get to know each other, the more they support each other. We're not just buying objects, we're buying lives and humans and people and real people. And I think that I don't know, like, that's my advice. Just keep doing it and do it more, but bring people together. And
that's fantastic.
It's hard during the pandemic. Okay.
It is. We wish we were with you today, obviously in person, but that's great advice. Bill, do you have anything to add?
Yeah.
As a museum director?
Again, it's ditto to Amy, because I had written down earlier, do what you're doing right now. But be sure that you are aware that you are responsible for the education of the public as well as critics to the power and the quality of women as artists.
We take that responsibility seriously. I think that's a great word to say. So thank you for that. And then finally, Elaine and Steven, would you like to give us advice, please?
I have some. Sorry.
This time it's solicited. I'm asking.
A thought. One of the things you find with membership organizations, and it isn't just women, it's any kind of arts-related membership organization, in the desire to be inclusive, the shows get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I would suggest that your ability to get more traction, particularly with an institutional museum audience, will be with a more constricted curatorial lens that focuses on only the best work. And that's not to say that the work that gets left out isn't good, but I think it's fair to say that smaller shows with a higher level of execution will tend to do better than these broadly expansive shows that seek to include as many members as possible.
Elaine, do you want to add to that?
No, I think.
No, I think that's great. And it's certainly something we wrestle with because we do have hundreds of members. We want to support hundreds of members. And, you're looking at the staff. And so, you know, this idea of doing multiple shows in multiple places. And so I do think it's something that we could aspire to grow and to be able to have more shows that are smaller and more focused on a particular theme or a museum's goals. I think that's great advice and aspirational for us to think about. So thank you.
Well,
So
Sandra,
thank you to all of you. Were you going to add something? Sorry.
yeah, I was going to add something just very quickly, and it seems peculiar, but I only act as juror for 2 shows a year. That's it. And at every one of them, I remind, because there's always an artist who is not aware of the absolute necessity of presentation of his or her work, that the presentation is so important. Minor point, but one I wanted to make.
Well, I think that's great. And it ties into artist education and networking and all of those things that we do hold dear. So thank you for that. I want to thank each of you. If we were all together, we would all be clapping. And I'm hoping the audience is probably clapping wherever they are. This was just so informative. I learned so much from each of you. And you've really helped us extend our own mission. So thank you very much. To the audience, if you are with us in about an hour, we'll be back here, the same place, to give the awards for the show that is in Clarksville right now. So we hope we will see you back. And thank you again to our generous donor who's remaining anonymous, who allowed us to make this happen today. So thank you to all of you, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.